from Robert Brown about his ex-wife called Joanna Simpson. There was two big red flags. The first one is he's talking about domestic abuse, basically saying it's serious. So as an investigator, that is telling me a lot of things. The second thing is the fact that he's instructed a solicitor. Why would he do that? That means that police action needs to be immediate. Where is his ex-wife now?
Within hours of making the call, Robert Brown arrived at the police station for his pre-booked appointment.
They're now recording, Robert, so if you could just say your name, that'd be great.
Robert Brown.
Right, it's now Monday the 1st of November 2010. Have you had enough time to discuss matters with your solicitor?
Having contacted the police and said that he wanted to report a domestic incident and that it was serious, when Robert Brown got into the police station, he actually climbed up and said no comment and wouldn't talk about anything.
Robert, tell us everything you know about the whereabouts of Joanna.
No comment.
But you've continued to want to speak to police and to come to the police station. Is that correct?
No comment.
It is highly unusual for someone to go along to a police station with something of this seriousness, volunteering to go in, and then making a no-comment interview. It doesn't make sense. It's a very, very difficult situation for the police to be in.
You've phoned up the police wanting to speak to a police officer. We're here now. Okay? We are here now to speak to you. Alright, you've made that call. We didn't phone you. You've made that call. Alright? We're here now to speak to you. Alright? You've obviously made that call for a reason. You wanted to speak to someone. Speak to us. That's why we're here.
Oh, no comment.
This is a very concerning case. So police were dispatched to Robert Brown's ex-wife's cottage. Has the house been disturbed? Are there any signs that there's been a fight or any violence? Is there any furniture that's been disrupted? Is there any vehicles there, doors open? Anything that gives any signs that something has happened?
One of Joe's friends rang me and said, have you spoken to Joe this morning? Because he'd heard there was police around the house. And I said, no. So I tried to ring her mobile. I tried to ring her landline. No answers from anything. And then we were told she was missing.
Jo would never disappear and she would never leave her children. There's no way she would leave those children.
And I said, there's something awful happened to Jo, I can feel it.
When police officers arrived, the lights were on, the TV was on, and Joanna's phone is there. So they had a look inside, and the mantelpiece and everything else was intact. But very disturbingly, on the floor were some blood spatters, and also outside on the gravel. That is of extreme concern. Why is the blood there, and whose blood is there?
Joanna is missing. Blood has been found at her home. Robert, tell us everything you know about the whereabouts of Joanna.
No comment.
Tell us everything you know about any injuries that Joanna has sustained.
No comment.
Who was harmed?
No comment.
This is no longer a missing persons case. This is something far more sinister.
Jo was the most wonderful, caring, lovely daughter anybody could wish to have. She would ring me about 3 times a day, sometimes lunchtime, and always in the evening, usually when the Archers were on, which was always a bit of a problem because I loved the Archers. And I sort of had to think, now, I know that'll be Jo ringing, but she won over the Archers. If I had a problem, she would somehow sort it out. She was the person everybody turned to. All her friends turned to Jo if they were in trouble. She'd help anybody and everybody.
Jo was really kind, really loving, a brilliant friend to have. She was great fun. You know, she was the sort of friend that would spur of the moment call you up and say, "Oh, come over for a drink." We just understood each other.
She loved her friends dearly. She would do anything to help them, anything at all. She was just a very good person altogether. Jo had been married previously, and sadly her marriage had just broken down.
It was a very difficult separation, but they weren't managing to have children, and that was something that was very important to Jo. So she was quite vulnerable, and the clock was ticking.
She was sad, but being Jo, she always put on a brave face, always.
But before long, Joanna crossed paths with someone new, a man named Robert Brown.
She said, I've met somebody. He looks a bit like Sean Connery, and he's a pilot. She was very much attracted to him.
I think all the focus is on the fact he was a BA pilot, because it just tells you a story about somebody who's clearly quite well educated, professional. A pilot suggests a certain type of character, someone who's stable, strong, responsible, steady under pressure, calm.
Things moved very quickly because he met her in March, and they did a trip at Christmas where he proposed to her, and they were going to get married 6 weeks later. I said, oh, you must bring him over. So she did, and I'm afraid that her father and I didn't like him straight away. He was arrogant, he was rude, but how do you tell your daughter of 30-odd years that, this is not right? And Jo's father said to me, this is going to be trouble.
After her first marriage broke down, Joanna Simpson became involved with British Airways pilot Robert Brown. But her parents had an instinct to protect her.
Jo's father said, I'm going to have to ask him to sign a prenup.
Joanna's father, who had a trust fund for the children, was concerned that if Jo married again, that ultimately over time, all of the hard work that he'd put in would not end up being, for the benefit of his lovely daughter. And so he felt quite strongly that it would be quite important to sign a prenup, which would mean that effectively the wealth that he had created for her, would not be part of any kind of separation were they to separate.
Her family was quite wealthy. Robert Brown didn't think a prenup was the type of document that someone like him would have to sign. It wasn't that kind of relationship. He wasn't that kind of person. But Joanna's family insisted on it, so he just thought he'd just go along with it.
It's now my very great pleasure to pronounce you both husband and wife together. And you may now seal your marriage with a kiss.
The wedding was just for a small number of people. And they put up a sort of little marquee. And they had an evening reception at Jo's house. I was very pleased. They both seemed happy. But then, sadly, on the honeymoon, Jo called me to say, Mara, I've made a mistake. She said he was very unpleasant to the staff in the hotel. She said he's being very rude to people and, who don't like it. She discovered his true colours and was very unhappy. But then she got pregnant, and she was just so thrilled to be pregnant. She really was. I think she was very vulnerable and probably lonely, wanting to have children. I think she felt probably, the years were rolling by, and she said, I'm just going to stick with it.
With a child on the way, the couple settled into Joanna's home in Ascot.
When Alex was born, I have to say he was a good father. He was a hands-on father, and they seemed to be getting on together. And then Katie was born 18 months later. So the family seemed complete. A son and a daughter, how lovely.
No comment.
As a police interviewer, where you're confronted with no comment, what you need to do is to change your tactics to find something that they will talk about.
The purpose of this interview is background information. We're going to ask you questions about yourself. Now, it sounds like you're probably better at it than I am, but a similar hobby to what I've got, running.
In this case, what he was willing to talk about was himself and how good he is.
I've always been a runner since university days, and been really good at it as well, actually. Well, I've been UK Trail Champion 3 times.
There's a sense of grandiose behaviour. He's saying that he runs 50 miles a week. He later talks about his job. It's all centred on him.
I do think we're getting some elements of narcissism here from Robert Brown. It feels like he's showing off about his running ability and prowess. And it's strange to me, just given the context. You know, it's not like a conversation with a friend or in a pub, and they happen to be talking about running, and he's just bigging himself up. This is him being questioned as a suspect.
Do you get to pick and choose what flights you want to do?
To a certain degree, yeah, I do. I should have been in Lagos at the moment, but I'm not.
He's willing to talk about himself and how good he is, but paradoxically he's talking about how bad his former wife is.
She lies to someone and then they do the dirty work for her. That's the way she operates as a person. You could say that a spoiled child, if you like.
He's definitely angry and very, very bitter about the whole relationship.
Whilst it may have seemed perfectly normal on the outside and fine on the outside, actually behind closed doors it was very, very far from being a happy relationship.
Everybody loved Jo except her husband. He belittled her. He never actually praised her. Never. He would say he didn't like the food she was serving, he couldn't eat that. He was rude to her friends.
He was surly. He would just glare at us, really, or grunt. The best we could probably get was a grunt. Really not friendly, really not welcoming. And it was quite clear that he didn't want us around when he was there. I can remember one day him coming through the kitchen and just giving some curt comment back to her. And, you know, I looked at her and there's just literally just one tear poured down her face. That's how he would make her feel. And it is so opposite to how she was as a person.
Jo seemed to be just putting up with his treatment. Just putting up with it. She always tried to cover for him, actually. And he just kept going. He didn't apologise, say sorry, or anything. He would go running or go and sit up in his study. So she was always on her own.
You know, she did not have a partner. She had a husband who lived his own life, did his own thing, and showed very little care or love towards her.
Jo decided to try to get marriage guidance counselling, which was a joke, really, because there's no way Brown would settle for marriage guidance counselling. He would know better than the counsellor. There was no way he was going to accept anything that he was told. No way. He has to be in control.
As time went on, Joanna started to feel that Robert's dislike towards her was because of her wealthier upbringing.
Robert Brown had a massive chip on his shoulder. There is no doubt that he felt that she'd had it easier, that he'd had it really tough. So Robert Brown would often try to sort of go into competition almost around how humble his upbringing was, you know, being brought up on an estate in Edinburgh. His father was a shipbuilder. He would talk about the fact that they would not always have food on the table, but nonetheless, he's done very well. He's become a British Airways captain. He's earning £150,000 a year. It's what gave him status. But he's married to a woman who is strong, who is vivacious, who is really outgoing with the world. And the home that they're in is a home that was hers originally. So you've got a man there who is starting to feel some resentment around everything that she represents. And his way to address that is to intimidate her, is to make her feel worthless. Because that's his way to try to ensure that ultimately she is within his control.
When we try and think about why Robert felt this way, I think that he probably feels inadequate and it attacks his masculinity. I think on top of that, he might make constant comparisons in his mind and he might worry about his own financial independence in the future. And of course, if Robert doesn't resolve these feelings of inadequacy, then it can lead to resentment and this could fester and it could grow.
Almost a decade into their marriage, their relationship had deteriorated further. Robert convinced himself that Joanna was being unfaithful.
I phoned up one of our friends and I said to her, is Jo having an affair? And she denied it, but I knew she was having an affair, but I just didn't know who it was. She denied that anything had been going on. And then we had a sort of a bit of an argument.
Jo had been out for the evening with some friends and she came back about 10 o'clock with the children and he met her and said, where have you been? And so she told him. He said, you're having an affair. And she said, no, I'm not. He pulled a drawer open, grabbed the knife, grabbed her by the throat and stuck the knife to her. And she said, "What will happen to the children if you kill me?" And he said, "You'll be dead and I'll be in prison." She managed to talk him out of anything to hurt her. And he said, "I expect you're going to call the police and ruin my career." And sadly, she didn't call the police. And he said, "If you tell anybody what I have done, it will be the worse for you."
What has made it doubly bad, and how it's made everything so much more worse, is that she wanted me out of the house. And what happened is that she alleged that I f***ed her with a knife at that time when I confronted her, which didn't happen.
But the police involved you?
No, the police were never involved. No, I mean, not at all. I mean, nothing happened.
We know at this point Joanna didn't contact the police about this incident, and it could be fear, so it could be that she was literally scared of the physical repercussions from Robert.
After the knife attack, we always told Joe to never be alone. When he brought the children back after they'd been with him, to always have somebody with her. The divorce was terrible. Divorce was acrimonious.
They tried to sort things out of court. Joanna had offered him £500,000, which he'd turned down.
He was trying to get far more, and he was sending her abusive stuff all the time. Just awful.
He would send really nasty messages to her, and they got increasingly erratic and they got increasingly nasty. So one of his favourites was parity is the road to happiness, because as far as he was concerned, he wanted 50-50. He wanted 50% of everything, even though the house hadn't been his in the first place.
He just couldn't bear Jo to have her house still. He just couldn't bear it.
He was adamant that he should have 50% care of the children. He didn't have the means to have the children for 50% of the time. He was a British Airways captain. But he wanted 50% of the time of the children only because he wanted to be able to use that as leverage on the finances.
All the way through, he has to be in control.
But the prenup signed back in 1999 complicated matters for Robert.
Her father's there. I didn't want it was just to please everybody in a way. That's why I signed it. And then I went off to Antigua next day. That's why his divorce has taken so long, is because it's been false prenups and it's been delayed and delayed.
In the 90s, prenups were not commonplace, and they certainly weren't something that legally had much standing, actually. And so I'm sure that Robert Brown signed it because he really didn't feel like it was going to be worth the paper it was written on.
He later thought that the family had deliberately asked him to sign it so they could keep Joanna's money with her and he wouldn't get access to her.
While the prenup's validity had to be investigated further before a divorce settlement could be finalised, Robert's behaviour got increasingly worse.
He would quite often be seen sitting in his car at the top of the drive, just sitting, watching, which was really intimidating.
Joe put up CCTV. He cut the cables. He used to take photographs through the windows of the house.
He'd bought surveillance equipment and had been tracking her car and was trying to follow her movements. So there were signs of this building up over quite a period of time, his obsession with her and the bitterness that was going on behind the scenes.
Now that Robert has left the house, it feels like his stalking behaviour is a form of intimidation and of controlling the situation. So he is sending a direct message, which is, I'm still here, I'm not going anywhere.
Joe rang the police, and this policewoman came and she said, I'm afraid we can't do anything about it because he hasn't hurt you. So more CCTV was put up, hidden where he wouldn't be able to see it. I mean, she had to be so careful how she did these things. I was desperately worried. She said, oh, it'll be all right, Ma. Because she'd actually been able to talk him out of killing her, so she felt she had the control over him.
Two and a half years into the divorce proceedings, Robert had started a family with someone new.
He was was in a relationship, and more importantly, she was now pregnant. And it just seemed like that could and would be the turning point. We could see an end to it, and a positive end to it, for him, apart from anything else, which is what was so badly needed.
We were all pleased that he would get on with his life, carry on being a British Airways pilot, and Joe said, I escaped. If he can't get what he wants, he's going to get rid of her. Brown took the children for the second half of half-term, and so she was on her own, and he said that he would like to bring the children back an hour later than planned. Jo called me to say she was looking forward to having the children home. She was chatting away about fish pies and things. She was starting to do a curry for the children coming home and baking a chocolate cake for them. She was really looking forward to it.
Hello, Thames Valley, please.
Yeah, hello. I'd like to make an appointment to come in regarding an incident that occurred yesterday. It's sort of a domestic issue. An incident of a serious nature.
Right, when you say serious, can I ask what it is? How serious?
I really don't want to say anything, actually.
This is a phone call from Robert Brown, and listening to that, I was giving half a story, and when the call handler is probing that, he's being extremely evasive, so he's clearly hiding something.
Well, I've spoken to my lawyer, and he said not to say anything, so...
Can I ask why he said that?
Well, it's extremely serious nature.
What's strange to me about this phone call is it seems like a half confession, and also Robert's trying to distance himself from it. So he's saying a bad thing has happened as opposed to I've done a bad thing.
Is it your girlfriend that's in the situation, or no?
My ex-wife.
And you're both okay, are you? You're not, none of you are harmed at all, are you?
Well, we have one person is.
It does feel like Robert has an agenda in this telephone call. He wants to go for an appointment with the police. He doesn't want them to come over to the location where things have occurred. So it feels like there's an element of him trying to control the situation and also control the narrative.
After Robert Brown contacted the police to make an appointment, the police forced entry into her house, and it became apparent straight away that something had gone seriously wrong. There were traces of blood found on the rug in their hallway and on the gravel outside.
After alluding to authorities that his ex-wife Joanna Simpson had been harmed, Robert Brown was detained at the police station.
The police wouldn't tell us anything. Nothing at all. It was the waiting game. And so you were hoping that maybe he'd hit her and put her in like a garage or something, that we kept hoping that she might be found alive.
We thought maybe he's held her captive somewhere. And that's what we kind of held on to in terms of hope.
Robert's been in custody for a few days now, and he continues to be interviewed. And detectives haven't got too much evidence, so what they've got to do is to look elsewhere.
With no other witnesses, police were faced with a difficult decision to interview the children.
What we're going to do is just show you an extract of that. Basically. Okay. Before we do, is there anything you'd like to say?
No, not really. Do I have to see the interview?
Well, I'm going to show it to you.
The children were in a nearby room, and they heard an argument between Robert and Joanna.
And then what happened? And they got into a fighting area, did. So we had a fight. Then could you hear? I just
Very distressingly, Katie, the daughter, saw her mother wrapped in a plastic sheet being put into the boot of the car with her leg hanging out. She said a At this point, Robert insists that the children get into the car, and the children asked if they were taking Mummy to hospital, and Robert made no reply.
This morning, and he didn't come out.
That is raising the stakes, that is raising the evidence. He knows that he's got to give some sort of answer for that. But what does he say?
No comment.
Katie talking to the police, not knowing where her mummy was. She was only 9. Awful. Never wanted to hear it again. I was distraught.
Catherine, she needs to know where her mum is.
Sorry, no comment.
Something you want to say about what Catherine has said?
No comment.
Is she lying?
No comment.
Has she made that up?
No comment.
If she is lying, can you think of any reason why she would be?
No comment.
It's now Wednesday, the 3rd of November 2010. Robert, we're still in interview number 5. We are going to continue to ask you a substantial amount of questions.
Yeah, well,
Police asked Brown again about the night of Joanna's disappearance.
You've arrived at the cottage.
we're getting to the stage where I'm getting a block. I don't want to say anything else.
During the interview, he keeps continually weighing everything up. And there are some questions which hitherto he hasn't answered about what happened in that house.
Was there anything else that you were talking about?
I'll answer that. It wasn't a court case, it was about the children.
Can you tell me what you were talking about?
Schools.
Schools.
Very genuine remorse there. It's hard to say. I would argue probably not, because if there was, he would have confessed earlier. There's probably regret as he's coming to terms with his future. He must know that he's absolutely going to prison, potentially for a long period of time. There's maybe an element of relief of just having the whole situation over with, to having to stop playing this game with the police. So I'm sure there's just a tumultuous mix of different emotions going on.
Not only did Brown reveal what had happened to Joanna, but he also disclosed her whereabouts.
Robert Brown has told us that he buried Joanna in Great Windsor Park, which is a huge, huge area. It's like looking for a needle in a haystack.
I tried to hide her in a box from the garden centre. I would be prepared to show officers where this is.
My name's John Hunter. I'm a forensic archaeologist. A forensic archaeologist assists the police in looking for where murder victims might have been buried, and then excavating them and recovering evidence that would help the case. And so we were asked to go and excavate the grave and see what was there. It was quite a thick woodland. It's not the sort of place where you'd find anybody walking. There's no tracks there. It's not the sort of place where you'd see many people at all. It's well off the beaten track. And without having him taking us to the spot and saying, there's a grave here, it would have been very hard to find.
It is very steep in places and rocky, and it's not managed. So there's big trees down there with branches everywhere.
How did you get Joe down there?
I just dragged.
Okay.
It's downhill.
So there won't be any sort of drag marks for them to look for?
I think what you find is it's all leaves everywhere, so I'd be extremely surprised if there's any marks.
When I got there, the scene of crime team showed me an area of disturbance in the ground. And my job there was to identify, look at it, investigate it, and try and work out whether it was a grave or not. If it was a grave, to excavate it.
The team carefully removed layers of soil until a large garden storage container was discovered.
Now, you've mentioned a box.
Yeah.
Is Joe in the box? Yeah. What type of box is it?
It's a garden box.
When that box is open, Joanna is in that box, unfortunately and sadly, and a pathologist has a duty to...
All their toys, and she'd had a terrible cold, and there was paracetamol on the glass of water just by the bed, and I just found that really comforting. So I slept in her bed.
Robert Brown was charged with the murder of Joanna Simpson, and a trial date was set.
There are some stories that truly stick with you as a journalist. This one in particular has always stuck with me, and I think it's because it was so shocking. A husband killing their wife, a husband, somebody in his position, you know, their background, the type of family that they were, their professional lives. It was very unusual.
The courtroom watched as Robert Brown entered the dock.
It was really chilling to see him. All I could see was his eyes. Those dark, dark eyes. Soulless eyes.
I don't think I really looked at him. To me, he's abhorrent. I don't really want to see him. I just was looking at the jury. That's what I was told to do, look at the jury.
Brown's legal team outlined the defendant's plea.
He was charged with murder, which means that he intended to kill or seriously harm Joanna at the time of her death. But the defence to that charge, in his case, was manslaughter on the grounds of diminished responsibility. So he was saying, yes, I killed her, but when I killed her, I was suffering from this mental abnormality called an adjustment disorder.
An adjustment disorder is an abnormality of mind whereby you are experiencing such profound difficulty in adjusting to a change in your circumstance that it becomes an illness. In other words, that he had experienced a difficulty in adjusting to the breakdown of his marriage and the divorce proceedings to the extent that it caused a mental abnormality arising from a recognised medical condition.
I think his defence was that he was really badly treated the whole way through by the family of Joe, that he'd had to sign this prenup.
His perception of it was she being, in general terms, from a wealthy background, that an attempt was being made to deprive him of his entitlements, and that he was not being fairly treated in the divorce proceedings.
Robert Brown felt that he was being targeted by her lawyers, and he felt he was being harassed by them. He blamed them for everything and for tipping him over the edge.
Intense anxiety, depression, inability to think straight, lack of sleep. He said that they were the symptoms he was experiencing at that time as a result of the marital breakup in the months prior to the killing.
It's like a cup, isn't it? And everybody's got their tipping over point. If you add in all the lawyer stuff, the school stuff, the financial stuff, the next court case, the kids get on your back, all the stuff you got to do, suddenly.
He even suggested in court that he had considered crashing this plane full of passengers on board just to get out of the situation he was in.
I just didn't think that the jury would believe it.
I mean, literally, probably 80% of the population has got an adjustment disorder in some shape or form. And yet it can be used as an excuse for murder. It just blows your mind.
In Mr. Brown's case, he did take the stand, which would have been a strategy decided between him and his defence team.
It is unusual in a case of diminished responsibility, not without precedent, but unusual.
He seemed very confident. He was a very good witness in that sense because he would be very believable.
He started to paint Joe as being effectively the perpetrator, effectively the abuser, effectively the person who was trying to control Robert Brown, and being the bitch from hell.
He was saying how she was a manipulator, how she was Princess Perfect, he called her. I wanted to stand up and shout rubbish. Just dreadful. I just had to hope that the jury would see through all his lies.
I vividly remember him breaking down on the stand. He was wailing and sobbing, kind of put his head and his hands down on the stand in front of him, and he was apologising to her family who were in the public gallery just above the reporter's bench, saying, I'm sorry, they hadn't meant to do it, and that it perhaps had just been a moment of madness.
In my opinion, it did not appear authentic, but ultimately it was a question for the jury to decide whether his presentation was authentic or whether he was being manipulative and conning towards them.
Once the defence made their case, the prosecution maintained that this was not a matter of manslaughter, but a deliberate act of premeditated murder.
It must be borne in mind that an adjustment disorder is more likely to arise in somebody who may have difficulty in coping generally. It's very important to bear in mind in this case that Robert Brown was the British Airways airline pilot, somebody who one would hope and expect to be able to deal with stress.
Mr. Brown was saying that at the time of the killing of his wife, he had a mental illness. And it was going to be very difficult to establish its existence without him giving evidence of the things which he said had brought about that condition in him, when if you looked at his medical records, there appears to be no history of it.
When I interviewed Mr. Brown some months after the killing, he presented as fairly polite, composed, articulate, and he was quite contained and only answered questions in the way that he wanted to. So in some ways he was quite controlling in the interview in terms of what he wanted to talk about, but he didn't become upset or distressed at any stage, in marked contrast to how he later appeared during his trial. There were no signs of an adjustment disorder.
The courtroom heard how Brown may have scouted the burial site well in advance.
I said to the children, "Would you like to see where Mummy was found?" And they said they would. And so we went with the police and took flowers. And as we approached it, children said, "We know this place. We've got a den nearby." So whilst they were in the den, he was probably digging the grave.
The wardens for the park told us that actually where he dug it, people don't go into that area for probably 10-15 years. I mean, it's not somewhere the wardens go through.
I do know that he did do a lot of running through the woods, so the woods would have been familiar to him, and what looks not particularly obvious to anybody else might seem very obvious to him in terms of landmarks and pathways and trees.
I've always been a runner since university days, but I run every day. And always have done.
Do you have set routes that you do?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's structured.
Are they all local?
It's structured, yeah.
We do know that Robert was very familiar with this specific area of woodland, so it is possible that this whole time he was actually scouting a suitable location to bury Joanna's body, because we do know the killers often select places where they are remote enough to not be disturbed, but also familiar enough that they feel comfortable in those spots.
The container in which Joanna was buried raised further doubt on Brown's defence.
Was this grave dug in a hurry, or was it carefully prepared? If it was dug in a hurry, the chances are that it was never intended to be a murder or a death. Conversely, if you find a grave that looks as though it's been carefully prepared, then it's quite clear that it may well have been premeditated. It seems to me that the garden storage unit was so tightly wedged in to the clay, because the clay sides that surrounded it had bowed in slightly, and as squeezed it, it was very difficult to get out. If you leave a side open which has got clay sides, it's a matter of weeks or months, the clay sides bow inwards. So my opinion was that the unit had been put in the ground several weeks, if not months earlier.
To us, it was murder. It was premeditated murder. The box had been put in a pre-dug grave, which the forensic archaeologist had said had been there for weeks, if not months.
Eventually, on the Tuesday, we were told that there was a verdict.
There were gasps from everybody. I think nobody could quite believe it. It was a really shocking, very surprising moment that nobody had expected.
During Robert Brown's trial, the prosecution presented evidence indicating that the burial site had been dug weeks or even months in advance. But Brown's defence challenged this claim.
It was put to me by the defence that the grave was not a grave, but rather a place that Mr. Brown wanted to bury what he called the sham of his marriage, and would dispose of various documents and so on.
He said it was to put his divorce papers in. And obviously, it was a load of rubbish.
In the crates with Joanna's body, there were cable ties, white forensic plastic suit, latex plastic gloves, a surf bag with straps, things like that. Again, all points to the fact that this had been pre-planned, these items had been bought specifically for this job.
It was lined all sorts of things, like a murder box.
Details from the post-mortem were read out to the court.
Robert Brown paints a picture of putting her in the box after having pushed her. When that box was opened, we are told a completely different story. The pathologist says that this woman had been struck 14 times. That is not consistent with falling over.
The post-mortem determined that Joanna had been struck on the head with a claw hammer.
Furthermore, there were defence wounds as well. That is not consistent with falling over.
When confronted with Joanna's injuries, Brown told the court he had taken a claw hammer from his bike shed and hidden it in his daughter's bag on the night of Joanna's death.
The one element that he didn't try to explain in front of the jury was why he'd got this hammer in his daughter's homework bag, which he put in before driving the children back round to Joanna's house. He had no explanation for that. He didn't explain why he'd put that in the bag and why he'd felt the need to take that to his wife's house.
During the trial, various theories as to Brown's motive were put forward to the court.
What I find interesting in this case is that on the surface, it seems like Robert Brown had moved on. He'd got a new partner, he'd got a new baby, yet despite this, there's something that he just couldn't let go. We're seeing somebody who just can't move on past this part of his life. He's somebody holding a grudge, somebody who's quite bitter, and probably even paranoid as an individual.
To my mind, the prenup being accepted as law, that was actually Joe's death sentence. Because he knew he'd lost. He knew he'd lost, and that's why he killed her, because he wasn't going to get half of what she had.
But of course, this wasn't about the money. The money was simply the vehicle through which he was trying to exert control over Joe and felt that he could get to her. He was going to lose in his mind, and he needed to win at all costs. And he needed to retain control over her, and this was the ultimate act of control.
The prosecution described to the court a timeline detailing what they believed happened to Joanna.
On October the 31st, Robert's dropping the children off. The children went into the house, into a nearby room, and Robert followed them in.
He, for some reason, which we now know, chose to carry the children's bags into the house. I suspect Jo was fearful the minute she saw him coming out of the car. They must have had an argument. He went over and he got the hammer out of the bag and bludgeoned her to death. Police strongly believe that his plan was to leave the house with Jo in the boot of the car, and then the children turn around and say, "Mummy's gone," and he would claim total ignorance. But at that point he had to do something because the children were saying, "What's going on?" So he put them into the back of the car and he drove away with Jo in the boot of the car.
What happened next is the children were dropped off at Robert's girlfriend's house, and then he went completely off radar.
He drove off into the night and drove into Windsor Park, and he put her in the grave that he had prepared months before.
The trial came to an end, and the jury went out to deliberate.
It felt like a slam dunk case. It didn't really seem that there was much to decide, and we had got some words ready to go, assuming that he was going to be found guilty of murder.
We spent over 3 days sitting, waiting. Just torture. Eventually, on the Tuesday, we were told that there was a verdict, and I found that really quite distressing, actually, looking at the jury and realising quite how important these 12 people were in terms of any future.
Nobody at all knows what the jury verdict is, so everyone filed back in very silent, as it always is. You could hear a pin drop, everybody waiting.
My heart was beating so hard, I could just, it felt like it was going to jump out of my chest.
The jury foreman stood up. He was asked whether they found Robert Brown guilty or not guilty of murder.
And he said not guilty.
The jury acquitted the defendant of murder, but guilty of manslaughter on the ground of diminished responsibility.
The whole court gasped. There were gasps from the public gallery, there were gasps in the media, amongst the press benches. There were gasps from everybody. I think nobody could quite believe it.
We knew that a manslaughter verdict would possibly be maybe 5 years in prison.
I looked up at Robert Brown and he smirked. There you go, he won.
Robert Brown was acquitted of murder, but found guilty of manslaughter on the grounds of diminished responsibility.
I just stood up and left the court. I just couldn't bear it.
The judge almost immediately made clear that he thought the jury had made the wrong decision.
It may be that the way Robert Brown came across to the jury was as rather charming, a high-flying British Airways pilot who had succumbed to terrible distress, anxiety and depression because he was distraught at the breakup of his marriage. And I think they may have been manipulated and conned by him.
There was a female jury member who was crying in her seat. I think she had her head in her hands at one point. It just added to the emotionally charged atmosphere in this courtroom.
We were all in tears. The police were in tears. We were in tears. It was incomprehensible to see and watch.
Often in these cases, defendants are sentenced on another day, but in this case, the judge moved swiftly into the sentence. When the judge was sentencing Robert Brown, he made clear that he thought the killing had been premeditated. The judge therefore sentenced him to manslaughter, but the judge, in doing so, immediately made clear that he would give Robert Brown the maximum sentence that he could.
Robert Brown was sentenced to a total of 26 years.
When they said 26 years, I mean, it went from utter horror to almost euphoria.
I think that everybody was amazed that it was such a long sentence. It was amazing.
But a manslaughter conviction meant that Robert Brown would only serve half of his sentence before an automatic release.
To our horror, we realised it was a determinate sentence, serving only 13 years in prison and 13 years on licence.
That seemed wrong. It seemed really, really wrong.
He will literally walk out of prison without any psychological assessment. We've got to get some justice for my daughter. We couldn't sit back and let this appalling sentence be allowed to carry on.
We researched the law to understand the structure of the law. We start to discover that partial defences are heavily exploited by domestic killers because they use them as an excuse to get away with murder, because they basically say that it wasn't my fault, it was her fault. It is based on a culture and a society back in the 1950s where it was legal to rape your wife. We're in a very different world now, and yet we've got a murder law and sentencing and procedures that are no different to what they were in the 50s.
How do you explain to anyone that 26 years actually means 13?
We campaigned really, really hard, both myself and Joe's mother.
Hetty told me Joanna's story and about Robert Brown's imminent release. I was horrified. It was so obviously wrong.
I have seen case after case after case where manslaughter is handed out to somebody on the basis of an obviously and clearly premeditated crime because somebody snapped.
And the only person on this planet who can change this is the Secretary of State for Justice.
Diana and Hetty have run this extraordinary campaign, and I do pay absolute tribute to them. And I said to them I would do, as Secretary of State, everything I lawfully and properly could to ensure that justice is done for them and indeed for society.
I am very anxious about how the decision will be made, but I have no choice, we have no choice but to trust the system. We have lived with the fact that Robert Brown would be entitled to be released in November 2023. We were very nervous at that point.
Hetty actually went to the Ministry of Justice. I stayed here with my husband, and I zoomed in.
Diana and Hetty's campaign launched a judicial review into Robert Brown's time in prison, which revealed the true extent of his behaviour.
And at the heart of that was some quite distressing information, actually. He has, throughout his time in prison, shown absolutely no remorse whatsoever. He has shown narcissistic behaviour towards anybody who's an official. He has refused to do any rehabilitation programmes, including healthy relationships, because he doesn't believe that he needs to. And probably most worryingly, rather than talking about his remorse, he has spent all of his time in prison victim blaming, so effectively blaming Joe for what happened and also showing extreme grievance towards Joe's family and friends. That is the nature of the man that we're talking about, and the man who the law has now decided has become more dangerous in the time that he's been in prison than he was before he started. The judge that heard the judicial review came back 2 weeks later with the judgment that the Secretary of State was within his powers to detain Robert Brown.
Using the powers that are available under the 2022 Act, I have exercised my discretion to block his automatic release, which would otherwise have happened.
It will now be up to the parole board to determine whether Robert Brown will remain in prison or can serve the remainder of his sentence on licence.
We are really trying to keep him in. That's really what I hope we'll achieve with all the publicity we're doing. I mean, it is tiring doing all this. But if we can achieve him staying in prison for the full sentence, then dear God, it's worth it.
He hasn't come before a parole board yet, and so, yes, if he shows adequate remorse and suggests, and a parole board believes that he's a reformed character and is no threat or no danger to society, he could be released, and that could happen in the relatively near future. So at this stage, the family, nobody knows how long he's going to remain in prison.
Robert Brown can be a charming man, and so if he approaches the parole board in the guise of wanting to charm them, then I could see a world where he could end up hoodwinking them.
Obviously, Robert Brown is going to present himself as well as possible when he's in front of the parole board. He's going to try to be charming, he's going to try to be persuasive, as most people in his situation would. But the parole board are professionals, and if they are carrying out their functioning correctly, they're not just going to take into consideration his presentation, they're going to look at the evidence of his time in prison, and they're going to use that to make their decision about whether he's safe to be released. Having said that, I think it is fair to say that there have been some criticisms recently about the parole board making the wrong call in high-profile cases.
When Robert Brown is released, because it's not a question of if, it's when. When Robert Brown is released, well, we're terrified about when he's released. Terrified about what he will do. There are going to be licence conditions around him in terms of where he can go, but he won't obey licence conditions. He's never obeyed anything in his life. It's all about his rules. If he wants to get to me or Di or anybody else, he'll get to them. And knowing the chilling information from the judicial review that he does hold a very significant grievance against myself and Di in particular because of what we've done, and knowing that I've said that Robert Brown will be really angry about the fact that he wasn't let out of prison when he wanted to be, and the last time I said Robert Brown was really angry, he then killed Joe 9 days later. And even if he's not been released, he has the right to apply for parole every year. I just have to pray and hope that by the time he does come out, maybe he'll be too frail to be able to do anything too fundamental.
We'll keep fighting. We've got to. We've got to. For the sake of his children, for my son and his family, for Hetty, and not just our immediate sort of group, but for women in general who won't know this man.
I guess what's been strange for me over the last couple of years is there's been so much campaigning, so much talking about it, that it's almost become normal, and I've almost stopped thinking about my lovely friend as my lovely friend. I miss my lovely friend.
He looked like he came right off the golf course like a movie star. Tan, handsome, just Mr. Cool.
He always wanted to be the one who was on the call when it was a really horrific scene.
He was able to just move from one place to another, and there didn't seem to be any consequences to it.
His apartment looks like a mad scientist laboratory.
All of a sudden, people who thought this young, handsome, charming doctor was so wonderful are starting to doubt exactly how wonderful he is. My name is Bruce Sackman. I am the retired special agent in charge of the Department of Veterans Affairs for the Northeast United States. My entire career has been involved in hospitals and investigations of medical professionals and staff. Every possible crime that you could think of can actually occur in a hospital. I had nurses and doctors that were stealing medication. I had contract fraud. There was an entire list of cases that I had until one day I got a phone call that really changed my life. It's the chief of psychiatry at the Northport, Long Island VA. When I say VA, I mean the Veterans Affairs Medical Center. She says, Bruce, you're not going to believe this, but we have a physician working here who spent time in prison for poisoning his coworkers. And I look at the phone, I look at the calendar, I says, what is this, April 1st? How could somebody who spent time in prison for poisoning their coworker become a doctor at the VA? She said, look, Bruce, we got wind of this story in the newspaper. Check it out. So I grabbed one of my agents in the office. We get in the car. I said, I have to go meet this guy. He looked like he came right off the golf course like a movie star. Tanned, handsome, blonde hair, aviator sunglasses. I mean, just Mr. Cool. If my daughter brought him home and said, hey, Dad, I want you to meet my boyfriend. He's a doctor at the VA hospital. He's an ex-Marine. I would say, come on in. Welcome to the family. I would be excited. We started talking to him. And I said, while I'm here, do you mind if I just look around your room? And that's when his attitude completely changed. All of a sudden, he wasn't Mr. Charming anymore.
Michael Swango was born in 1954 in Tacoma, Washington. He was the middle of 3 children, and from all accounts, he was really his mom's kind of golden child. I'm Dr. Joni Johnston. I'm a clinical and forensic psychologist and private investigator. Michael was incredibly bright and gifted from a very early age. He excelled in school. He was musically talented. I think he was tested at an IQ of 160, which is off the charts pretty much in terms of intelligence. Michael had sort of an unusual interest from an early age in death and violence, and he began collecting these scrapbooks that were pretty gory. They were pictures of car accidents. He was interested in the Holocaust and would collect pictures. And his mom didn't seem to think there was anything amiss with this. She, in fact, would sometimes cut pictures for him or headlines from newspaper articles and give them to him. He realizes, shortly after he joins the Marines, that this is not going to be a lifelong career for him. So after a couple of years in the military, he is honorably discharged and decides he wants to go back to college. However, this time he wants to become a medical doctor. During his 3rd year and 4th year, some very concerning things began happening at this university.
His fellow students referred to him as 00 Swango, licensed to kill. Because apparently, every time he was visiting patients, a small number of them seem to expire unexpectedly.
In his last year, one of the residents observes him going into a pregnant woman's room. He has been told to take a detailed history and physical from this woman who's about to give birth. And he's observed coming out after about 10 minutes. His supervisor looks at what he submits. It is this elaborate document, just outlining, her entire life, basically, including every medical issue she's ever had. And this supervisor realizes there is no way in the world that anybody could get this kind of information in 10 minutes. And they realize that he is, in fact, making up stuff about these patients. And he is in danger of getting kicked out of the program.
I'm Dr. Brianna Fox. I'm a professor in the Department of Criminology at the University of South Florida. Swango was able to use his charm and convince the university not to kick him out and to give him another year to let him prove himself. And during that time, he's doubled down. He spent more time with patients. He got his medical license and degree and graduated. Despite the fact that Swango almost did not graduate from medical school, he was able to land a very prestigious residency. This is one of the top teaching hospitals in the nation. But people started noticing quickly that there was something not quite right about Swango. He had this obsession with Nazis and the Holocaust. He seemed to want to talk about death and the real dark side of their profession.
Part of his pleasure was talking about these things and watching the discomfort of his peers as he discussed them.
He had a very disturbing element about him that really set some people off.
There are all of a sudden being these medical crises. More patients are dying. They're not terminal patients that are dying. She's a gymnast. She's somebody who's been in good health, but she's been involved in a car accident. And she's got some significant injuries, but she certainly is not in a life-threatening position.
She's actually improving in the hospital until she gets a visit from the Dr. Swango. Then she dies unexpectedly.
It's extremely sad for all the medical staff who've been involved with her. And they just can't understand why this young woman who has her whole life ahead of her would die so suddenly. Nobody at this point has come out and accused him of anything or gone to administration, but there is this suspicion that's building.
All of a sudden, people who thought this young, handsome, charming doctor was so wonderful are starting to doubt exactly how wonderful he is.
They basically conclude that there's no evidence that Michael Swango has definitively harmed any patients. However, I think it is very interesting that as part of that investigation, they decide after a year not to invite him back to continue his residency, which is a pretty significant event. After Swango is released from his residency, he goes back home. So he goes back to Quincy, Illinois, and he begins working as an EMT for Adams Ambulance Service.
He did that because he really loved the excitement of a code or an accident. You know, when I say a code, like a cardiac arrest, and the bells and whistles are going off, and the nurses and doctors are coming, running in. His fellow workers are saying, why is this guy who's a doctor why does he actually want to be an EMT? He gives them a story because he's so charming. He gives them a story and they buy it.
One of the things they noticed pretty quickly is he always wanted to be the one who was on the call when it was a really horrific scene. So he would even show up at times when he wasn't even on duty. He also seemed particularly interested in being there when people were kind of crossing over, when they were done.
Swanko becomes very isolated. Colleagues at the ambulance company in Quincy do not want to hang out with him, and he feels very rejected by his colleagues.
On one occasion, he decides to bring some donuts to work, which was very surprising to his colleagues because he was somewhat of an outcast. He says, hey, we're all working, we work together. I brought some donuts for everybody, here they are. And 4 people in particular eat these donuts and they all become violently ill. Except for Michael Swanko, who is completely fine. They manufacture an emergency and they send Michael on this call. And meanwhile, they go in his locker and what they find is incredibly alarming to them because one of the things they find are bottles of ant poison. One of them is empty, one of them is full, and the main ingredient is arsenic, which causes symptoms very similar to the ones they all experienced.
They actually set a little bit of a trap for him where they left some iced tea out.
They leave it out in the break room for everybody to enjoy, thinking this is going to be too tempting for Swango. He is going to feel the need to somehow sabotage this tea. And so they leave it out for a few hours.
They had this iced tea tested, and the iced tea was loaded with arsenic.
Police execute a search warrant on his apartment, and they are surprised to find not just ant poison, but so many other different types of poisons.
They are absolutely astonished because his apartment looks like a mad scientist laboratory, essentially. It is filled with all different kinds of chemicals. There are books on poisons. There are books on serial killers.
I'm Kelly Kreff. I'm a freelance writer, and I've been writing to Michael Swango for about 15 years. He was very, very well studied about toxins, about chemicals, about medications, and how quickly they could kill somebody, what side effects they would have. He wanted to know everything and anything there was.
Swanko says this is just his little hobby and his obsession with true crime. He's just trying to replicate it at home and doesn't exactly take any responsibility or implicate himself for either the poisoning of his colleagues or what he may have planned to do with those poisons in the future.
And they end up bringing 7 charges of aggravated battery against him for his poisonings of his work colleagues.
Immediately after being released from prison, Swanko wants right back into the medical profession.
He applies for a physician's job in West Virginia, and they quickly find out his whole background. So he is not hired there. He then applies for residency in South Dakota, and he is hired. He absolutely aces his personal interviews, just bowls them over, and also spins a pretty good story.
His story to everyone was, yeah, I spent a little time in jail. You know what happened? I'm an ex-Marine, tough ex-Marine. I got into a barroom brawl, and I got sentenced to prison for beating somebody up. But the governor of the state actually restored my civil rights. here's a piece of paper from the governor of the state restoring my civil rights. And because there was a shortage of physicians in some particular parts of the country, they said, okay, we forgive you, ex-Marine. We understand. Come on board. Nobody at that time even took a moment to look past what he was presenting, because he did it in such a professional, charming way that they just accepted his story.
He can be, when he wants to be, extremely charming. So I would think that this would lull people into this false sense of security, and they would initially never suspect he had any sort of nefarious motives.
You have to remember, we're talking pre-internet. So it wasn't so simple as a couple of keystrokes checking out the name Michael Swango. All right? That didn't exist. Hospitals simply took the word, for the most part, of the applicant and assumed that all the documents that they were presenting were true and accurate.
Everybody seems to like him. They think he's a very good doctor. They're impressed.
He's doing pretty well, to tell you the truth. He's doing pretty well. In fact, he meets a nurse, and they get engaged, and everything is just beautiful. Her name was Kristen Kenny.
I think that perhaps Michael Swango has convinced himself that he has overcome this black mark on his career, because he makes a decision to apply to become a member of the American Medical Association.
The American Medical Association is the association that almost all physicians belong to. They checked on him.
They find out not only about the fact that he's lied about the circumstances for his criminal conviction, they find out that at Ohio State there were in fact some very clear suspicions that he might have been harming patients. And so they pick up the phone and they call South Dakota, where he's working.
There's actually a TV program that featured Swanko's case, where they were showing how he had been involved in poisoning his peers, and yet he was still practicing as a medical professional.
Also, there was an author who was out starting to write a book about him, so there were many things going on at the same time.
His girlfriend, really unfortunately, had no idea what was going on with Michael Swango in terms of his past or anything he had done. And so all of this just blindsided her. She had also been experiencing some physical symptoms around this time.
She says, Mom and Dad, I was getting these headaches, but I'm feeling better now that I'm home. And all of a sudden, the doorbell rings and it's Swango. Mr. Charming is back, and he charms his way back to her life again. But it's not the same, and she's very, very depressed over the whole thing. She writes a note. She says, I love Swango. I can't take it anymore. I can't live anymore. I really loved him.
She ends up going into a psychiatric facility for a few days, feeling suicidal. She's discharged, and she goes to a park, and she shoots herself. Her parents are just beyond devastated. Chris's mom has never liked Michael Swango, and she is absolutely convinced that he is, in some ways, at least indirectly responsible for her daughter's death. He legally changes his name because I think he becomes aware that he is not going to get another residency as Michael Swango. So he becomes David Jackson Adams.
It's It's a rather prestigious medical center out on Long Island. They have a teaching arrangement with the Veterans Affairs Medical Center. Guess what area or specialization he applies for? He applies for psychiatry. So you know what that meant? That meant he had to go in front of a board of trained psychiatrists and convince each and every one of them that he should be in their program. So if he could convince a board of trained psychiatrists to take him in, you could see how he could convince just about anybody to take him in.
He was able to just move from one place to another, and there didn't seem to be any consequences to it.
Most of our physicians here are not ex-Marines or ex-military. So now at Stony Brook, we have an opportunity to send a veteran to a veterans hospital. How wonderful that would be.
They do not know about all the things that have kind of followed him in Ohio State or in South Dakota. But pretty quickly, patients began dying unexpectedly. And we say quickly, we're talking within a couple of days of him arriving. There's a 60-year-old man named George Siano who comes into the hospital, and he's got some chest congestion, but not somebody seen as in a life-threatening situation.
He was seemingly okay, but all of a sudden is going into cardiac arrest. And it's Swanko sitting there on the radiator in his room, watching him as he is convulsing and yet does absolutely nothing to try to help. And Siano ultimately dies.
Another patient of Michael Swanko's is Baron Harris, who's 60 years old. He comes in with pneumonia. His wife is very devoted to him. And she's in the room visiting him one day. And Michael Swanko comes in and he injects him with something. She's not sure what it is. And pretty soon after that, he begins to deteriorate. And he ends up dying a few days later. Doctor responsible for hiring Michael Swanko, without deeply checking his references, resigns. Meanwhile, the head of the medical school writes a letter to other medical schools across the country, essentially warning them of Michael Swanko, to make sure that no other medical school is duped by his fake credentials and fake names. He was working for a government facility, so any fake documents he gives them is a federal offense. And so the FBI is beginning to take notice of him. And he is also aware that they are going to be charging him likely for, at the very least, fraud or providing false information. And also that he is never going to work as a physician in the United States again. And so before the FBI has a chance to arrest him, he disappears.
He hops on a plane and he goes where? To Zimbabwe, Africa.
I think he picked Africa because he was very aware of the fact that they needed him there as an American trained doctor. So he was welcomed with open arms.
I never conducted a homicide investigation before because I never had any reason to. It was new for our entire agency. And we narrowed it down to about 6 patients who the team, in their opinion, thought should not have expired when they did. The families were wonderful. They actually wanted to be at the cemetery and watch the exhumation. We were very, very respectful, because when we talk about, the forensic science and the investigation, Sometimes we forget there's a whole human side to this. They made a determination that these people were poisoned with two drugs. One of them is a drug called succinylcholine. In the hospital, they call it Sux. They use it to intubate, to put a tube down you. It essentially paralyzes you during this procedure. If used properly, it's a wonderful drug. If not used properly, it will kill you. The second drug they determined was epinephrine. Epinephrine is actually adrenaline, and it could speed up your heart, and if used improperly, it could kill you as well. Kristen Kenny, even though her family had the body cremated, they kept a lock of her hair. We tested that lock of her hair. It was loaded with arsenic. Swango was actually poisoning his own fiancée.
I've always been interested in humanitarian work. I've always wanted to be in a place where I can make a difference. And I really think I can make a difference at your hospital.
They were just very happy to have this American-educated doctor in their midst who was willing to treat their patients. Nobody would suspect that he was there for a murderous rampage.
Within months, it has become clear to the head physician of this hospital that this person is not who they thought that they hired.
The Zimbabwe hospital officials become very concerned by the high rate of deaths that started happening since Swango arrives.
They began to very directly suspect him of murdering some of the patients.
He goes from one hospital to another hospital, and the people there were very bright. They really suspected him of killing people, but he's always like one step ahead of them in Zimbabwe.
Again, there are more deaths, more suspicions surrounding him.
After a period of time, he decides that he needs to change countries again in order to make sure that he is not found culpable of any of his misdeeds in Zambia. And so he applies for a job in Saudi Arabia, and he's hired. However, in order for him to get to Saudi Arabia, he has got to get a visa. And that requires him to come back to the United States.
We had issued an arrest warrant for him. So when he returned to get that visa, he actually got arrested. We arrested him. But not for murdering anybody, because we didn't have that evidence anytime. We arrested him for every federal agent's favorite crime, lying to the government. If you lie to the government, that is a felony. So he lied to me when he gave that story about the barroom brawl, and his whole status was baloney. So he got sentenced to a couple of years in jail for lying, and that gave us that window of opportunity to end our internal investigation. You know, when we do these cases, it's almost impossible to make an accurate determination on the total number of people that were victims. We really have no choice but to zero in on the very best cases. And that's what we did with Michael Swango. Essentially, the government said this to him: if you go to trial, and even if you're found not guilty, we have an extradition agreement here with the government of Zimbabwe. So we're just going to put you on the plane and drop you off on the tarmac in Zimbabwe. And they're just chomping at the bit to get their hands on you. Well, he decided to plead guilty. Thank goodness.
He did not want to go back to Africa and face whatever their court trial systems are. So even in his getting captured, he was very strategic in protecting himself as much as he possibly could.
Some of the things that come out during the trial from a psychological standpoint I think are really, really interesting. His journals that he keeps. He has all kinds of writings in there. One of the things he says is to the effect that he can look in the mirror and really see himself as a god, as somebody who, really has the power of life and death. But also, he talks so much about the pleasure that he gets watching these people suffer.
Judge Mishler said something I'd never heard before. He says, there's no parole in the federal court system, but if Congress should change the law and grant parole, your parole is denied in advance. So there's no way this guy is ever getting out of jail again. And he's now in a place we call Supermax Federal Penitentiary in Florence, Colorado, where all the bad, super bad people, like terrorists and mafia hitmen, that's where they all go. That's where he is today. It's been reported that he killed as many as 60 people around the world. I don't know if that's true or not. It may be. He's never confessed to it, and he won't talk about it anymore because you know what? If he all of a sudden said, I killed somebody else somewhere else, well, he could be retried and actually get the death penalty for that murder. So he's not going to answer anymore. After he confessed in federal court to killing our nation's heroes, he also was brought to Ohio State and he confessed to killing that young gymnast, Cynthia McGee. Thank goodness he did. And that young man that hit her with the car, he was exonerated because he didn't kill Cynthia McGee. Dr. Swango killed her.
I was not looking for a friendship or any sort of relationship. This is very much a literary project for me. It's very hard to find murderers for life or on death row who happen to be doctors, dentists, lawyers, people who have advanced degrees and who are very, very, very bright and very well spoken. Michael Swango fit the bill. He led and leads a very compartmentalized life. He seems to lack a conscience, doesn't seem to have any guilt, definitely thrives on risk. So his letters are very intense in that he underlines lots of words for emphasis, and there's like always some footnotes and numbering. They're very, very detailed, and they have a very particular look to them. He always uses pencil, never types them, doesn't use pen. So here's a letter in which I ask him very specific questions about how he feels about his murderous misdeeds. And I ask him, like, how did you feel when you were killing people? What were your feelings? And he said, honestly, none. There could be 15 or 20 incidents in one weekend, or I could go for none for 2 to 3 weeks. But if he's saying like a long period of not killing was 2 or 3 weeks, and a more prolific time of killing was 15 or 20 incidents in just a weekend in Africa, then think about what the number, if this is true, think about what the number is. According to him, there is no motive. And I'm not a psychologist, so I can't begin to understand the motive. But what he has said is that there was a feeling of euphoria when he killed. No personal feelings about that person, not that he wanted to kill them because he hated them, more that he got away with something and he pulled off a seamless crime without being discovered.
This is somebody, I think, who was sadistic. And I think people who are truly sadistic, which is really rare, they're likely psychopaths plus. So they can acutely feel and understand the suffering they're creating, the pain they're creating. It's just that it gets transposed, and for them it becomes pleasure.
Swango, I think, just had a fascination with death and the power of life and death over a person. It's very, very intoxicating. You know, that is certainly one reason why medical serial killers do what they do.
I think if Michael hadn't been caught, he absolutely would have continued to kill. I think he's also very savvy and was looking into different poisons and learning every day about better, more deceptive methods of harming and killing. We're always taught to kind of revere doctors and respect them. We think of doctors as somebody who's going to help us. But to think that they've strategically planned to hurt us and to use their authority and their ability for evil instead of for good is just so jarring and so scary.
One of the best things to come out of the whole Swango case was that the world of medical credentialing improved dramatically, because no one wants another Swango now. Not that it can't happen again, it can happen again, but they've tightened up tremendously. This one particular case really changed my life, and I speak now all over the world. I really want to educate the public, the hospital employees, and the police on what's out there and how to do these investigations correctly. So that sort of became my mission, something I never expected until I got that phone.
It was a horrific attack on an elderly woman. She had been struck at least 30 blows to her head and face.
She had fractures to her skull, cheekbone was broken. It's at times hard to fathom how another human could do that to another human.
Attacked in her own home and killed. The town was shocked.
He was deemed to be the most dangerous man in Britain. He was on the run and he was desperate.
The number one priority was to locate him and catch him as quick as we could. He was a real risk to the public.
Nestled in the rolling hills of Northumberland lies the picturesque town of Hexham.
Hexham is a good place to be. It's a very established community, lots going on here. It's welcoming.
You walk up the streets, everybody speaks, everybody knows you. It's just a lovely town.
Hexham has a very close-knit community. It's exactly what you'd expect in a rural area.
It's also got a lot of farmland around it, a really good quality of life. It's regularly voted as one of the best places in the country to live.
It's quite affluent. It's a thriving market town with pubs, shops, everything you'd expect to find in a rural part of Northumberland.
It's got a beautiful cobbled market square, beautiful abbey, very quiet, low crime rate, not a great deal happens there.
But the peace in Pretty Hexham is about to be shattered.
We received a call from a member of the public in Newcastle city centre, which was probably 30 miles from Hexham. The member of the public had been walking through one of the streets in the centre of Newcastle and had found a handbag on the top of a public bin on the side of a pavement.
They saw the bag and thought it was a bit odd because I think it was in quite good condition, and they took it and handed it into the police as lost property.
It was apparent there were no valuables there, so the suspicion was it had been taken with the intention of taking whatever was in it.
The police searched the handbag to see if they could identify who it belonged to, and inside they found some ID.
The ID was in the name of 77-year-old Hexham pensioner Judith Richardson.
Officers were dealing with what they thought was just a lost bag.
The police in Newcastle got in touch with the police in Hexham, and the police in Hexham went around to the home of Miss Richardson to explain to her that her property had been found.
When the officers got to Hexham and called at Judith's address, they were expecting to find someone who would answer the call and probably say that the bag had been stolen.
But when police knock, there's no answer. With concerns about Judith's age, they decide to gain entry.
When they got in, they found Judith dead in the hallway of her flat.
It was clear from the injuries sustained, which were horrific, that, someone had done this. It was clear that it was a homicide because of the level of injury.
She had been struck at least 30 blows to her head and face.
And that's when they began a murder investigation.
I was head of the CID for Northumbria Police at that time. The senior investigating officer that was conducting the investigation at that point came to see me and briefed me about the occurrence. This was a completely random attack. We were simply presented with a body in the passageway of a house. We didn't have any idea at that time who the offender was.
Officers piece together what they can about who Judith was.
She lived on her own in a small flat in a very nice part of Hexham. She was just a normal person living in the community and going about her daily business.
She had a very, very simple life. She didn't have any close family in the sense of children. She was a spinster and lived by herself with a dog. She was well known to the local church where she attended regularly. She was a real pillar of the community.
With nothing untowards in Judith's life, investigators turn to the scene of the crime.
The first things to do are to secure the scenes, and the scene at the address is the first scene where the body is, but obviously there's the corresponding scene in Newcastle city centre, which is the handbag and the bin. So we've got to take control of those scenes to then enable us to conduct inquiries in the right way so we don't lose evidence.
There's no evidence of a break-in, but it's clear drawers and cupboards have been ransacked, so forensic officers focus on items of interest to see if they hold clues.
On the floor of the hallway of Miss Richardson's home, when her body was discovered, was an Age UK leaflet. Fingerprint was discovered on it. A tissue was found that was stained with blood and found within the bedroom of Miss Richardson's home.
While While the tissue and the leaflet are sent to the lab for tests, Judith's body is carefully removed and examined by a pathologist.
I was the crime scene photographer in the post-mortem. Judith was a 77-year-old woman. Reminded me of my grandma a little bit, and the attack was so severe it is at times hard to fathom how another human could do that to another human. There were a lot of injuries to photograph. She had fractures to her skull. Cheekbone was broken. There were lacerations and bruising to the brain, and she had a lot of bruising all over her body. And Judith had a number of kind of cuts and defensive wounds as well on her hands and fingers. It was really clear that the cause of death was from blunt force trauma. And there was some speculation at that time that it could have been caused by something like a hammer. I think everybody was quite shocked just at how brutal and savage this attack was.
Something like this would and indeed did send shockwaves through the entire community. It's totally unexpected. The ferocity of the attack was absolutely exceptional, and particularly for to happen in a place like Hexham.
Couldn't believe that a little old woman would be attacked in this town, you know. Just didn't know who was loose about. Oh, it was just terrible. The town was shocked.
Investigators turn their attention to the place where Judith's bag was found, in the hope they can discover who may have dumped it there.
The senior investigating officer at the time made a really good call early on to obviously focus on the bin and the surrounding area, and in particular the CCTV that covered that part of the city, and try and lock down any CCTV, particularly in Newcastle city centre, that may overlook the bin in question. But it was really important that detectives were sent to secure any cameras from shops, business premises, from public CCTV on lampposts or whatever, to ensure that none of the evidence or potential evidence was lost. And it was a case of trawling through to ascertain who put the bag on top of the bin. A little squad of officers were put onto the reviewing of the CCTV. One of the officers started by focusing on the bin around the time that the member of the public had called it in. So working backwards from that time, there was only one camera, I understand, covering that bin, and it was a long distance shot with a very poorly pixelated image that showed the bin.
Something piques the detective's interest.
Looked like a bus had pulled up near to the bin. A number of people had gotten off the bus. Could that have been the time when the bag was discarded at the bin? That grainy image then necessitated a contact with the bus company, who could only provide, a rough outline of lots of buses. We didn't have one particular bus at a particular time on a particular street. So we were presented with, quite a volume of CCTV, which has to be manually viewed. And it's a real arduous task. It's time consuming, it's difficult, it's painstaking, but that's the basis of what good detective work is.
But the hard graft soon pays off.
On one of the buses, there was an image from the cab of the driver which saw a man get off at Clayton Street at the relevant point. And actually, as he gets off the bus, his arm moves to the left and he places what we now know to be the bag on top of the bin. The number one priority was to locate him and catch him as quick as we could.
In Hexham, Northumberland, 77-year-old Judith Richardson has been found bludgeoned to death in her own home. CCTV has been uncovered showing a man getting off the bus in Newcastle and placing Judith's handbag on a bin. Police need to retrace their suspect's steps to track him down urgently.
There were hundreds and hundreds of hours of CCTV which they had to check in order to track down this footage which was of him on the bus.
So from that we got a description. The officers then went back in time and looked at the same CCTV from other cameras on the bus, and there in clear view, up the centre of the bus, sat in the middle, was the offender.
They had CCTV of him sitting on the back of the bus, the bag on his lap, which was absolutely crucial.
not hiding it, in open display, and it was on camera. So that gave us the clue that he's probably the man that's committed this crime. From there was a huge amount of work went on. One, backtracking on the bus to see where he'd come from, but two, to follow through where had he gone after depositing the bag. Now that necessitated several cameras in the city centre to be cross-referenced and cross-checked, but we had a description from the clear imagery off the bus of this individual wearing a green shirt. And it was on different cameras on a different street that this individual was spotted going into a jeweller's shop. When officers then went to the shop, there was CCTV inside the jewellers, and there's the offender pawning or selling what turned out to be Judith's jewellery. Once it was identified that he'd been into this particular jeweller's, officers were deployed to go and conduct inquiries. They spoke to the owner of the store, who provided a ledger where he'd signed a name. G. Jarman. I think it's fair to say that when officers recovered the ledger and the signature in the name of G. Jarman, they didn't for 1 minute think that that would be the actual name of the person in question. I think everybody thought it would be a made-up name. But unbelievably, it wasn't. And G. Jarman became the focus of our attention at that time. The SIO conducted immediate inquiries on the police national computer and identified that he was a missing sex offender from the Durham area. He'd been arrested for a shoplifting offence a few days before the murder and bailed to court, but had not appeared at court. So that was an immediate trigger for Durham to then raise the alarm and concern about this individual, who was now known as Graham Jarman.
Investigators are shocked when they uncover Jarman's criminal history.
He was a very, very dangerous individual. Obviously, Durham Constabulary, which is the force next down south from Northumbria, they had been managing him as a sex offender. So an officer, a risk management officer, would have been regularly visiting Jarman. They were going to be the font of knowledge around who this person was, his background, his hobbies, his habits, his lifestyle. And that individual provided us with significant information to paint this very detailed picture of who we were actually dealing with. An incredibly dangerous man.
He was previously identified as the most dangerous man in Britain in the early 90s. He was guilty of the most horrendous sex crime where he kidnapped a 17-year-old, put her in the back of a car, used a horrendous expression, "I'm your everyday psycho." He was also involved in a series of armed robberies, so he had a criminal career which dated right back to his early 20s, really. Bear in mind he was in his 40s and he had spent most of his adult life in prison.
His previous convictions were horrendous. There was rape, kidnap. He'd been to prison several times for long stretches of jail time. I think 15 years was one of them, 8 years was another. To say that he was a dangerous individual was an understatement.
But as detectives discover, Jarman hadn't always followed a life of crime.
People who knew him from the 80s think that he seems to be a very different person from the one that they knew then to who became this really aggressive, violent man committing a lot of crime.
Graham Jarman had worked as a civil servant, as I recall it, and then something had plainly happened that triggered him into a world of not just criminality, but criminality of the most serious type. And I don't know, certainly for certain, what that thing was that happened in his life, although, like everyone I've seen, it reported that he had a particularly significant reaction to discovering that he was adopted.
This is when it's believed Jarman's life started to spiral out of control.
He used betting shops a lot. As far as I'm aware, he's had gambling problems.
He had a compulsion to violence and sexual offending and robbery because of his gambling addiction, and was prepared to do anything, and then just seemed to, suffer the consequences, really.
He was a loner, he had no friends, He was quite articulate. He enjoyed reading broadsheet newspapers, but he was a horrible, nasty individual.
But police need to link Jarman with the place where Judith was killed, Hexham.
The guys then worked on the CCTV off the buses and were able to backtrack him to Prudder, which is another little area in Northumberland. Then from there, he actually got off the bus from Hexham in Prudder, went into a shop, and then got onto this bus and into Newcastle. So it was in effect backtracking back into Hexham, which is what they were able to do.
To track Jarman's movements in Hexham, investigators speak to businesses with CCTV. Chris Dunlop's pub is on the main thoroughfare into the town centre.
Police came in, asked if they could use the cameras to have a look if anyone had walked past, because we have a camera on one side of the building, a camera on the other side of the building. And it was just by chance that he'd walked past this camera and he was on this camera, and they just thought he was a strange man, so they followed him. There's the camera there that caught him walking past on the road.
We've been able to pull together from the compilation of the CCTV is that Jarman had indeed come to Hexham on the 17th. He'd stayed overnight in a guest house on the first night. On the second night, he apparently had slept rough somewhere in Hexham. And on the day of the murder, the Friday the 19th, he'd been seen walking up and down various locations in the centre of Hexham.
I think that the CCTV put him in Hexham observing elderly women. From what's known now, potentially looking for victims, for targets. And I know that there was CCTV of him leaving a hardware store in Hexham and Judith was entering.
Police now have a link between Jarman and the murder victim. But that's not all.
In the period before the killing of Miss Richardson, he was caught on CCTV walking towards her home. And in the period after her killing, he was captured by the same camera walking away from her home.
Round about the same time that we received an update from the forensic services saying that we received a forensic hit on a fingerprint that had been found on an AGUK form that had been left in Judith's house. And that fingerprint also matched the name Graham Jarman.
Also, his DNA was found on a tissue that was blood-stained within the bedroom at her home where she had been attacked.
In the meantime, there's been another big development.
A hammer was found in a Aldi plastic carrier bag. It was found on the wall of one of the neighbours.
The hammer was examined and DNA was discovered on it.
Blood and hair found on the head of the hammer matches the DNA profile of none other than Judith Richardson. But Graham Jarman's whereabouts are unknown.
Once we come to terms with the fact that we've got a really serious offender with a background that is just unbelievably violent and aggressive and whose mental state is such that, you know, he's been described as a psychopath, it's absolutely imperative to get a hold of the individual. So we had to try and track him down to protect the public. He had to be captured very, very quickly.
In Hexham, Northumberland, 47-year-old Graham Jarman is wanted in connection with the robbery and murder of pensioner Judith Richardson. After finding his fingerprint and DNA at the crime scene, police need to track him down urgently. Jarman's mother tells detectives he hasn't been seen at their home in Consett, County Durham, for weeks.
I know that he lived with his mother at the time of the murder. It was quite a curious relationship in the sense that she gave him money to spend.
His mother controlled him to a great degree and stopped him from, presumably, to stop him gambling everything away. But it also became apparent that she'd left in the weeks preceding to go and visit family.
So his source of income had been lost. She'd spent spent his allowance because of his gambling habits.
And Jarman had actually stolen from his own mother. He'd taken a DVD player and sold it, and then when he realised the mother was coming back, that was his switch to say, time for me to leave. And that's when he started the offending.
Investigators launch a manhunt. They need to retrace their suspect's steps after he pawned Judith's jewellery in Newcastle.
He was followed on CCTV, getting into a taxi which we believe went to Gosforth, which is an area at the north of Newcastle, and his whereabouts thereafter were unknown. He would jump on buses and travel all over the area, but his background and his previous offending meant that this was really number one priority for primarily North-East forces. The first priority really was to come up with a press strategy, which then meant speaking to the media, getting the message out, identifying who he was with photographs and imagery that we had to get the public to be the eyes and ears for the police.
Journalists and reporters from all over the North-East are enlisted to help.
We were called in for a briefing by Northumbria Police in order to explain the background to the case, the fact that he was on the run, the fact that they needed the public to try and keep an eye out for him in very simple terms, release a picture of him and appeal for assistance in tracking him down. He was deemed to be the most dangerous man in Britain, yet again having previously been identified as the most dangerous man in Britain in the early 90s. And as soon as his name became public, we were aware of the really horrendous background of offending, which he was guilty of and had been found guilty of previously, so that you knew you had a very, very dangerous individual who was out at large.
To add to the investigators' woes, Jarman is already one step ahead.
He was seen in a supermarket where he changed his clothing, so he was changing his appearance to make it much harder to track and find him.
We do know that he'd purchased a set of hair trimmers and he'd shaved his head to try and change his appearance. He was almost bald or looked, very closely shaven. The search was really about understanding him and trying to preempt where he was going to go. And what we thought was really important was to get the expert input from a forensic psychologist, which is what we did.
The reason they brought in a psychologist, although it sounds a bit like Cracker the TV series, was really to try and identify his motivations, his pattern of behaviour, what he was likely to do when he was on the run.
That psychologist came up to Durham and assisted with us. We spent hours with that individual, poring over who Graham Jarman was. He was able to paint this picture of the sort of mindset. He classed him as a psychopath plus.
The psychologist tried to identify what he might do next. He'd been living with his mum, so the chances were he was on the run and alone and was trying to fend for himself, really. Where would he get the money from? Could he potentially target another elderly victim?
The psychologist was then able to build and draw and come up with a really detailed offender profile of Jarman, which didn't only look at his history, but almost got into his head and his mindset of what he'd be thinking, what he'd be concerned about, what he'd be planning. And from that fed into our strategy for press releases to the public. When we were asking the public, rather than just saying, this guy's wanted, please tell us if you see him, we had to provide something more, and we were able to do that. The profile indicated that he was transient. He would travel on public transport, in particular buses. He would go into bookmakers to place his bets, if he had any money, that was. He liked going into libraries where he would sit and read. So this all had to be passed out to the public to try and get them to engage and be really vigilant.
Soon, a result. There's a sighting of Jarman in a betting shop some 50 miles south of Newcastle, in Saltburn. Then, 2 days later, he's found on CCTV entering a supermarket 20 miles west, in Yarm. For the manhunt team, this is a worrying trend.
As the days developed, we received sightings, information from other forces that suggested he was transient and moving. He'd gone as far south as Cleveland, and we had sightings in Stockton and other places in and around that area, which brought Cleveland police into the mix. So we now had the three northeast forces, Northumbria, Durham and Cleveland, one on top of the other, going south, and it was apparent that Jarman was on the move. And there was reason to believe he was potentially going to commit crime as he moved down. And there was a suggestion that he was potentially going right to the southern coast to see family and friends down there.
Forces in the southeast are also put on high alert.
And that's when it was press the red button and it becomes a really multi-force chase. We even contacted Sussex police at one point to give them the heads up that he may be on the way down, so they could start and advertise the fact that this individual may just suddenly appear on their patch.
There was information put out that people and the public should not approach him. There was recognition that he was a violent man, he was quite a dangerous man. They had more police presence in libraries, they put more presence around kind of betting shops.
There were meeting after meeting, hours and hours of research went into tracking him down. But every time we got a sighting, we were always that one step behind it. By the time we got the notification and went and checked the CCTV and confirmed it was him, he'd obviously moved. So it was frustrating. And not all of the sightings were actually of Jarman, and that was another frustration, and it always is on a manhunt like this, where every single request has got to be assessed, visited and checked out. We had several sightings that were Jarman, others were not and had to be discounted.
The manhunt team makes one final push.
We took the decision to really ramp up the media engagement and appeals to the public. And I took the lead on that in terms of conducting a number of interviews, appealing directly to the public and indeed to Mr. Jarman to give himself up. I think I did about 14 individual interviews with different media outlets, local news, TV, newspapers, radio stations, to push this message and really go for it in a big way to try and get that message loud and clear to the public. We need to speak to it as a matter of urgency.
Days later, news comes in from Yorkshire.
A librarian in Filey in North Yorkshire had heard the press appeal, had gone into work on Saturday morning, and she'd put Jarman's face, that was released in the media, on her computer screen as a screensaver, and got on with her business. And she was walking around the library that particular morning when, lo and behold, an individual sat reading a newspaper in front of her, and she realised it was Jarman, the very person we were looking for.
Obviously aware of the fact that he was dangerous, but aware of the fact that this fugitive was in her midst, she did exactly the right thing. Immediately got in touch with police, kept an eye on him to make sure he wasn't going anywhere, and not give away any kind of suspicion at all, which is obviously crucial in that context.
2 local bobbies turned up.
I was sat in Filey Library, just minding my own business, and I was just sat there, and then the police came in. I was wondering what was going on, and it turns out that they were after the man that was sat next to me on the computer. It was actually terrifying, to be honest.
He gave a cock and bull story about it not being him. They called in their more experienced sergeant who took none of it.
And he just stood up and went quite quietly, to be fair. He didn't kick off, didn't do anything, he just got up and left.
They promptly arrested him on suspicion of murder. And a live scan fingerprint check quickly revealed that we had our man.
In Filey, North Yorkshire, Graham Jarman has been arrested on suspicion of the murder and robbery of Hexham pensioner Judith Richardson. The 2-week manhunt, covering hundreds of miles across the northeast, is finally over.
It was an absolute relief to hear that news. I was delighted that he'd been captured, and to hear that it was in a library was the icing on the cake in terms of where we presumed he would be. There was a lot of pressure on us as law enforcement agencies to actually get a hold of this individual. There was a massive threat and risk to the public. It would have been a real tragedy had anybody else been hurt or indeed killed. So I was absolutely delighted with the combined efforts of all the police involved in the various forces. But I've also got to say that was just half of the story. Catching him was one thing. Building a case against him was the real issue. arrangements would have been made for Northumbria officers to go down to Filey, pick him up and transport him back to Northumbria, where obviously the SIO and his team progressed with interviews.
As I recall it, during the course of the extensive interviews that the police conducted with Graham Jarman, he did give an account of where he had been and what he said he had done.
And then, proceeded to give the various excuses about why he had the bag and belongings with Judith.
His account of the handbag was that he had been walking along the road where Judith Richardson lived.
He claimed that he'd simply been outside of Judith's property and saw the handbag lying on the wall and had picked it up, claiming that the real killer must have left it. Obviously that was complete nonsense.
In the meantime, investigators uncover more evidence of Jarman's crime spree.
It turns out that a couple of offences had been committed by him. On the way down, I think he was either in Whitby or Bridlington, he'd gone to the coast and observed a young fella parking his car up, getting a surfboard off the roof of his car, and then putting a wetsuit on and going into the sea. Jarman saw that as an opportunity to break into his car and stole, amongst other things, a wallet with the young guy's identification and credit cards and things. He then went into a shoe shop where a lone female store attendant was present, and he robbed her of money. And on leaving that store, he dropped an identity card which was actually stolen from the car that he'd attacked when the surf had gone into the sea. Which again I think was used to try and bluff his way when the officers arrived to speak to him at the library in Filey.
After 3 days of intensive interviewing, detectives believe they have a compelling case against Graham Jarman.
DNA police at the scene that had details of the journey to where the bag was dumped. That had CCTV of dumping the bag. That had him on the bus with the bag. He gave his name when he went to the pawnbroker's note to sell Judith's valuables. The evidence against him was overwhelming.
The SIO and the team put the case to the CPS, and Jarman was charged with Judith's murder.
Greenie KC is appointed to represent Jarman in court.
I have a clear recollection of my first meeting with Graham Jarman. What struck me about him was that he was plainly an intelligent individual and a clear-thinking individual who had his own ideas about his own case. So he certainly didn't present to me as an everyday psychopath. If you hadn't known what he had done in the past and what he was accused of doing, you wouldn't have guessed. He was straightforward, and certainly I didn't find him at all a difficult person to deal with. But at all stages, Graham Jarman denied that he was responsible for the murder of Miss Richardson and made clear that he intended to have a trial.
Graham Jarman finally faces justice at Newcastle Crown Court. He pleads not guilty to the murder of Judith Richardson.
He sits in court and he doesn't give away anything when the evidence has been outlined, because the jury are there and obviously be aware of the fact that the jury are watching him, because they tend not to show any emotion for obvious reasons.
The prosecution outlines Jarman's motive.
He was a gambling addict. He didn't have much money to his name.
The assumption is that he was simply looking for a victim in order to try and get a source of money, really. Prior to the murder, he was seen in Hexham, clearly targeting elderly women in order to rob them, basically.
But the prosecution sets out how Jarman clearly has violence in mind.
The CCTV played an important part in tracking him, leaving Beals, it's called, where he'd actually stole the hammer from. And I believe that's where they think that he spotted Judith as a target.
After following Judith home, Jarman waits outside, then charms his way in, pretending to be from Age UK, and accidentally drops the leaflet in the hallway.
It was a truly shocking attack. He brutally assaulted her repeatedly with a hammer.
He'd gone and started ransacking her property, and then he beat her for a second time,
leaving her dead in the passageway of a house.
It's believed Jarman cleans himself up at the scene, dropping the bloody tissue containing his DNA. then leaves with Judith's stolen handbag.
And the prosecutor made quite clear to the jury that the level of violence he used was completely, horrific, but also unnecessary given the context. He could have walked and taken all the valuables and walked out. There was no need to take her life. John didn't take the stand, and given the level of evidence against him, you can understand why that is the case.
We knew that we were facing a complex and difficult case. Graham Jarman was demonstrated to have been in possession of the handbag of Miss Richardson, and it was proved and indeed acknowledged by him that he had pawned some jewellery that belonged to her, getting £300 or about that for it, and even signing his own name for the receipt. Also, part of the case against him at trial was that he had changed his appearance in the period after the killing of Miss Richardson, to which his response was, "I'm a shoplifter and I regularly change my appearance so as to reduce the prospect of being detected for that crime."
The jury retires to consider its verdict.
The jury was in retirement for a number of days.
And eventually, the jury decided he was guilty of the said offence. The SIONIS team had delivered excellent evidence. It was overwhelming.
It was inevitable that the judge would impose a very lengthy minimum term, which he did. A term of 35 years. That Mr. John will have to serve before he can apply for parole.
A very, very long sentence was given, and I don't think he'll ever be released. I don't think he'll ever deemed to be safe, even when he's an elderly man.
The brutality of Judith's killing still haunts her town of Hexham.
This was a targeted attack for financial gain. And the really sad part about that is that from what he got, he actually only got £300. So this brutal murder took place for £300.
I'm sure the people in Hexham would have had a really negative impact by this crime. It's very rare, certainly in a lovely area like the market town that is Hexham.
I do think that justice has been served for Judith, but I don't think that Graham should have actually been out in the community. He had a really long, violent history. Had he been in jail, then this crime may not have occurred, and I think that's the really sad part.